or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It's morning where I am. Uh, I have the great pleasure to introduce a very needed and timely disputatio, we could call it, on Amoris Laetitia. In particular, it's infamous or famous, as you see, chapter 8. And we have two Catholic intellectuals, lovers of the church and lovers of truth, um, who will square off and who have been in the arena and have exchanged some writings back and forth. Both of them have written books, important books on this matter that deal with this matter. And so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce each of them. Eduardo Echeverria is a professor of philosophy and systematic theology at the Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. He has a PhD in philosophy from the Free University of Amsterdam and holds a licentiate in sacred theology for the University of St. Thomas, which is the better known as the Angelicum in Rome. He is the author of many books and many writings. He's very prolific, but the one that's most important for us is a 2019 book, which has now been revised. I don't know the revision when that was, Eduardo, but recently.
2019.
Okay, that's the revision. Okay, Pope Francis, the legacy of Vatican II. We also have Pedro Gabriel, who is one of the co-founders of Where Peter Is, virtually indispensable website these days, where he is one of the main contributors. He is the author of The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, so that will tell you his position right away. Currently, he's taking classes in moral theology at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross. He is also a medical oncologist, so he does God's work there as well. He reads for his parish and is a published writer. I'm very intrigued by this, of Catholic novels. I don't know what they are, but they're probably in Portuguese, but it sounds great. So we're going to start. Pedro is going to give us, the way it's going to work is we're going to have two opening statements by each of them 10 minutes long. First Pedro, then Eduardo, and then we're going to go, this is the format, we're going to go through the five dubia and get responses of 5 minutes each, and then we'll close with some closing statements. All right, so Pedro.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, according to where you are.
First of all, I would like to thank Eduardo for accepting to participate in this discussion, and also to Jim for accepting to moderate. Now, my position is precisely that Amoris Laetitia is an orthodox magisterial document, since it's based on sound traditional doctrinal principles in continuity with Francis' predecessors. It's true that Amoris allows a new sacramental practice. It allows divorced and remarried couples to receive the sacraments of reconciliation in Eucharist in circumstances that were not allowed before, namely in John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio. But the Church can have different disciplines or practices across time and space. Even the Catholic Encyclopedia, published at the height of the fight against modernism, admits as such on its entry on ecclesiastical discipline. Therefore, it's not sufficient to say that the sacramental practice of Amoris contradicts the sacramental practice that came before it. To say that Amoris is heterodox, one must prove that this sacramental practice contradicts doctrine. And I believe this is not the case. Amoris says that divorced and remarried people can receive communion even if they are still engaging in intercourse, something that was not allowed previously, provided that the person involved has mitigating factors that diminish subjective culpability to such a degree that this person is not in mortal sin. Now, to ground this practice, Amoris 301 brings up the church's solid body of reflection concerning mitigating factors to prevent the notion that the demands of the gospel are in any way being compromised. In the very next paragraph, Francis extensively quotes the catechism promulgated by John Paul II himself to explain these mitigating factors. Later on, Francis would elevate as authentic magisterium the criteria applied by the bishops of Buenos Aires. These guidelines say that Amoris Laetitia opens the possibility of access to the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist, if it is recognized that in a specific case there are limitations that mitigate liability and guilt. Francis then goes on to say there are no other interpretations. This is based on traditional sound doctrine. For a sin to be a mortal sin, three conditions must necessarily be present: grave matter, full knowledge, and full consent. If any of these is not present, then the sin is venial, not mortal. Mitigating factors limit knowledge and consent, but they don't interfere with the grave matter of sin. The sin still has grave matter, but the mitigating circumstances hinder full knowledge and full consent, so that the person did not sin mortally and can receive communion. This is, in fact, common practice for most other sins. As Rocco Buttiglione, a disciple of John Paul II, says, before, the divorced and remarried were sinners of a particular kind, almost excommunicated. Now, they have become ordinary sinners. So, those who affirm that Amoris is heterodox claim that it teaches that objective sin is no longer present in every circumstance. But I believe this is misreading of the document. One thing is the objectively evil nature of sin, and especially of intrinsically evil sin acts like adultery. Another thing is the subjective culpability of the sinner. The subjective culpability does not change the object. In fact, if we are talking about culpability, we are admitting that there is a sin. There can be no sin in something in which there is no culpability. The fact that sinner is more or less culpable does not change the object of the sin. It remains wrong. Therefore, we are talking about different planes which do not intersect. If Amoris Laetitia deals with subjective culpability, then it doesn't justify intrinsically evil acts. If it doesn't justify intrinsically evil acts, then the criticisms are not applicable and Amoris Laetitia is orthodox.
And that's my opening statement.
Eduardo?
Yeah. Jim began by saying that the title of Pedro's book, The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, states his position, which he just stated. My own position is also well stated in the 4th chapter of my Pope Francis book on chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, the controverted nature of Amoris Laetitia and the conflict of interpretations regarding it. I want to focus on three criteria that Pope Francis repeatedly has stated have to be implemented in order to understand Amoris Laetitia, and in particular chapter 8. The first criteria is about seeing the unity of thought, I would say, not just that you have to read the entire book, but that there's a unity of thought there in the, as it were, the pastoral logic and the moral reasoning that informs that pastoral logic. So that's the first thing, the unity of thought, I would say. And part of what I think here is that chapter 8 does not give you a coherent and systematic presentation of the pastoral logic and the corresponding ethical reasoning, the logic of ethical reasoning there. You have to draw that out and draw together these various aspects, one of which I agree with Pedro, one of which, of course, is that, the whole notion of mitigating circumstances and what follows from that for imputing guilt and holding a person accountable. But as I will try to argue, in many instances, of course, when you put together all these elements, only one of which is the mitigating circumstances, it seems to me, I will argue, I've argued in chapter 4 of my book, whether that was the intent of the Pope, I'm not going to discuss that here. It seems to me that the chapter 8, at the very least, we can say is problematic. So the three criteria that the Pope stipulates, one has to do with the unity of thought. The second has to do with the continuity. Pedro has argued that the pastoral logic there is continuous with the tradition, and the third criteria is the question whether the ethic, the moral reasoning there that informs the pastoral logic, whether it's Thomistic. Let me then begin by saying something. So with respect to the unity of thought there and the broad overarching framework of Francis's pastoral strategy. His pastoral strategy, I think, is expressed in Amoris Laetitia, paragraph 78. I'm not going to read all those things because that just takes time away. But if you look at paragraphs 76 to 79 and paragraphs 292 and 293, the core of his pastoral strategy is expressed in paragraph 78. He says, the light of Christ enlightens every person. Seeing things with the eyes of Christ inspires the church's pastoral care for the faithful who are living together, or are only married civilly, or are divorced and remarried civilly. Following this divine pedagogy, he says, the church turns with love to those who participate in her life in an imperfect manner. Now to me, that's a problematic statement, because it suggests that even if you're able to find moments, constructive elements, good elements in a relationship of people who are cohabiting, etc., it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to say that the relationship, qua relationship, somehow participates in an imperfect manner, in an imperfect form, or partial and analogous, and hence is somehow an incomplete realization of marriage. It seems to me that that's fundamentally mistaken. That's wrong, because what happens is that then you stop speaking of that relationship, qua relationship, as a sinful relationship. Francis theologically justifies the good or constructive elements in these situations, not just the divorced and civilly remarried, but it could be, cohabiting heterosexual couples, cohabiting homosexual couples, etc. By employing the concept of the semina verbi, or seeds of the word, in order to find goodness or positive elements in these relationships, suggesting that these relationships, qua relationships, are, as I said, imperfect forms, or as he actually says, partial and analogous, and hence incomplete realizations of conjugal marriage, ordered to the good of an exclusive and permanent relationship. However, this approach, it seems to me, and the one in this passage where the light of Christ is central, cannot do justice to the teaching of the Catechism, for instance, because it does not take seriously the reality of sin and man's resistance to the light of Christ in those relationships, qua relationships. Francis ignores that the human reception of that light is open to resistance and hence to distortion, misinterpretation, and rejection. John 1:9 describes light in its fullness and universality, but not every individual is in fact enlightened by the light. Therefore, the Word does not illuminate all human beings because they resist the light. Consider John 1:5-10. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. Both of these verses speak of the negative reaction of the world to the coming of the light. Where is this resistance to the light in Francis's pedagogy? For instance, in an address of the Pope to participants in the course on the marriage process, he says, at the same time, reach out in the gospel by way of meeting and welcoming young people who prefer to live together without being married. On the spiritual and moral level, they are among the poor and the little ones. We won't get into the exegesis of that. Towards whom the church, following in the footsteps of her master and Lord, seeks to be a mother who does not abandon but draws near and takes care of them. This approach runs the serious risk, I would say, of separating the church's mother from the church's teacher, of separating the pastoral from the doctrinal. Where is the illuminating truth expressed in the moral norm, prohibiting fornication in the Catechism, paragraph 2353, and all its consequences that offend the dignity of marriage, family, and weakening the sense of fidelity, as we read in paragraphs 2390? Why don't we hear the sexual act must take place exclusively within marriage? Outside of marriage it always constitutes a grave sin and excludes one from sacramental communion. So it seems to me, regardless of Francis's good intentions, it seems to me his pedagogy, the pastoral logic that informs this, doesn't really take seriously the reality of sin.
That was your alarm. You keep going a little bit.
Okay, so the second thing I want to say, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the dubia. It seems to me that Francis tries to provide a justification, a person and situation-specific justification for engaging in, even under those mitigating circumstances, engaging in sexual activity in a divorce and civilly remarried relationship, and it's not going to be enough. And we'll see that as we go on here. It's not going to be enough. It doesn't justify. You can't justify this purely in terms of mitigating circumstances. I think the Pope accepts the lesser of two evils calculus in trying to provide a justification. He also tries to provide a justification by carving out an exception to the moral law, hence confusing, in my view, negative moral precepts, which are moral absolutes, which are always and everywhere valid, with positive moral precepts, which have presumptive validity, but are indeterminate. Aquinas himself admits that they have that positive moral precepts. There's a certain indeterminacy to them. The more you describe the situation, the particular acts, and so on, they're going to be inapplicable. The Pope, it seems to me, in paragraph 304, confuses those two precepes, and then last but not least, when I say that he tries to justify in a person and situation specific way an individuals engaging in sexual activity, not only does it have to do with this lesser of two evil calculus, but also I think the Pope, despite his disclaimers, he really accepts the gradualism. His position leads to the acceptance because I know he says he doesn't, but his position really leads to the acceptance of the gradualism of the law. And just to define what that is, there's the distinction between the law of gradualness and the gradualness of the law. This is from paragraph 34 of John Paul II's Familiaris Consortio. Everybody accepts the law of gradualness. Everybody. I don't know of anybody that thinks that there's no moral development and so on. It's the gradualism of the law, which means that there are different degrees or forms of precepts, John Paul says, in God's law for different individuals and situations. So this gradualism of the law provides, a joy connected with, trying to carve out an exception for the moral law, because he confuses moral absolutes, negative moral precepts, and positive moral precepts, accepts an ethic, the lesser of two evils, calculus, and then, of course, last but not least, which is at the crux of this, the infamous paragraph 303. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. Can I? I'm going to call an audible.
Can I just make?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Because I think my sound was not functioning.
I think
properly.
that
it's better now.
It's much better. Pedro,
Okay.
I'm going to, since I let Eduardo go a little longer, and you were relatively short. But can I see if I can focus Eduardo's statements and see if this is acceptable to him? That the Amoris Laetitia doesn't take seriously enough the sinful nature of the divorced and remarried relationship.
I think that's part of it. In the overall pedagogy, he doesn't take seriously, and it's not just with respect to the divorce and civilly married. I gave the example of his talking about cohabiting couples.
Okay.
Etc. Right. But that's only the first point. The second point had to do with justifying individuals engaging in sexual activity in a relationship that's not that the church doesn't consider to be a valid marriage, since these people are they're divorced and not that there's no annulment and so on and so on. So it seems to me, just to sum it up, this point, it seems to me that the whole notion of mitigating circumstance, which of course I think is certainly a valid notion. It's in I don't have any problem with that. I have a problem with the way it's used, and but I think also you have to consider the lesser of two evils calculus. You have to consider his attempt to carve out an exception for the moral law. Even though that moral law has presumptive validity, I think the Pope confuses positive moral precepts, which Aquinas thought were moral absolutes, which are exceptionless moral norms. So committing adultery, having sex with someone who isn't your spouse, is a moral absolute. It's exceptionless. The Pope, if you read paragraph 304, is confusing negative precepts with positive moral precepts having presumptive validity. They have a prima facie obligation. You have a prima facie, but of course, Aquinas says there are going to be exceptions to it. But there are no exceptions to a moral absolute.
Right, to the negative.
And then, of course, as I said, the crux of it is, how one reads paragraph 303 in Amoris Laetitia.
Okay, Pedro, before we go to the dubia, I'm going to give you a chance I think a lot of Eduardo's argument is that he's not taken seriously enough the sinfulness, and everything sort of follows from that. But I don't know. You can respond any way you want, but that does seem to me to be the crux of Eduardo's point.
Yes, I understood the crux. I will provide my replies throughout the debate. If you want to pass on to the dubia,
Okay, let's do that then. Let's do that. That's fine with me. All right, so we're going to go through the dubia. For those who don't know, these dubias, it's just Latin word for doubts. It's a sort of a typical way the magisterium used to. It doesn't really so much anymore. Respond to certain questions people would ask the Holy Office or the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith yes or no, questions that could be answered in the affirmative or the negative. Anyone knows Denzinger, it's filled with this kinds of stuff, especially in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Okay, so these dubia, they were published, or it came to light in 2016, so relatively soon after the Amoris Laetitia, but have not received a response. And so, although they do seem to concretize some of the concerns here. So let me read the first one. It is asked whether, following the affirmations of Amoris Laetitia, numbers 300 to 305, it has now become possible to grant absolution in the sacrament of penance, and thus to admit to Holy Communion a person who, while bound by a valid marital bond, lives together with a different person in a marital way, more uxoria, without fulfilling the conditions provided by Familiaris Consortio and subsequently affirmed by Reconciliatio and Penitentia and Sacramento Caritatis. Can the expression in certain cases found in note 351 of 305 of the exhortation Amoris Laetitia be applied to divorced persons who are in a new union and who continue to live in a marital way? I think we have Eduardo going first.
Okay. So to understand this this first doubt expressed by the cardinals, and why is it that they raise this question, is again because, in my view, because of the lesser of two evils calculus. The lesser of two evils calculus. What does that mean? Because we need to understand this. It's not just mitigating circumstances. We need to understand this in order to understand why then Francis seems to be, or his supporters on this matter seem to be suggesting that a person who is even having sex in a divorce and civilly remarried situation, that they should be able to receive absolution. And so, of course, the question is whether or not does absolution, can they receive absolution even if there is a lessening of guilt, or even an eradication, such that you're not imputing guilt to that person, you're not holding that person accountable. And it seems to me that the way that Francis reaches that, and all the others that have written, even the example that Pedro gives at the end of his book, it seems to me implicitly works with an ethic, a lesser of two evils calculus. What does that mean? If you're working with a lesser of two evil calculus, that means that the question is no longer a matter of mitigating circumstances that limit a person's voluntary or subjective capacity to decide. No, it becomes a situation that limits the objective choice and that forces the person to choose between two moral evils, the evil that seemed to him to be the lesser. So what would that be in this instance? Well, we don't have to look very far. Francis himself, if it seems to me, if one reads this carefully, he's saying that in such situations, where for serious reasons such as the children's upbringing, a man and a woman cannot satisfy the obligation to separate, many people knowing and accepting the possibility of living as brothers and sisters, which the church offers them, point out that if certain expressions of intimacy were lacking or are lacking, it often happens that faithfulness is endangered and the good of the children suffer. So this is a concrete situation in which a couple, knowing full well the rule prohibiting fornication and adultery, cannot, as Francis says, act differently and decide otherwise without further sin. So the greater evil is going to be to commit further sins. The lesser evil, of course, it would seem, given the mitigating circumstance, it would seem that the couple can have sex because the implications of not having sex are going to be such that it may lead to the ruin of the marriage, and hence the implications for the life of the children, and so on and so on. So the lesser of two evils calculus here makes the choice, according to this view, the more morally permissible choice is made under a lesser of two evils calculus, and so you come to the conclusion that the lesser of two evils is going to be having sex. And it's going to be considered, as some have argued, it's going to be considered a venial sin, not a mortal sin, because of the mitigating circumstances as such. So let me, since I'm probably running out of time,
One minute.
Okay, let me conclude there with a quote from Cardinal Muller, who in his book, The Power of Truth, The Challenges to Catholic Doctrine and Morals Today. I actually wrote a review of this, but he says at one point, many are suggesting today that the sacramental absolution can be given to penitents who, on account of mitigating circumstances, can be said to be free of subjective culpability before God, despite the fact that they continue living in an objective state of grave sin. What is more controversial, he says, is its application to the sacramental order. Is it possible to use the probable absence of subjective culpability as a criterion for granting absolution? Would this not mean turning the sacraments into subjective realities, which is contrary to their very nature as effective, visible, and thus objective signs of grace? Now, just in conclusion, the other thing is, of course, a firm purpose of amendment, the resolution not to sin any longer. Pedro does have a section in his book where he discusses applying mitigating circumstances to past sins and applying them to futures, applying the same circumstances to future sins. It seems to me that this is completely unacceptable to future sins. Even if it's legitimate to apply it to past sins, future sins, the case that he makes there, it seems to me, is weak and at the end of the day unsupportable. It doesn't take seriously the Catechism's whole discussion of venial sins in paragraph 1863, and the impact that venial sin has, such that it says it tends to thus sin creates a proclivity to sin. It engenders vice by repetition of the same acts. This results in perverse inclinations which cloud conscience and corrupt the concrete judgment of good and evil.
All right. Okay. We gotta keep to 5 minutes. So
okay.
All right, Pedro.
Okay. Lots to unpack here. I'll probably unpack more across the very dubia. So starting with the actual dubium 1, I believe that the answer is yes. Some remarried people living moratorium, with the marital intercourse, can receive communion without fulfilling the conditions of familiaris consortio and reconciliatio.
Sound is messed up again somehow.
How about now? Can
Better.
you hear me?
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
better now. I don't know what it is, but
Okay. So I believe that the answer to that dubium is yes. Some remarried people can receive communion without fulfilling those conditions.
But notice that by simply answering yes, this gives a false impression. It gives the impression that that suddenly the communion can be granted to anyone. That answering yes is misleading because it's reductive. And see now how the dubia requiring a yes or no answer without theological explanation, as the cardinals intended, isn't a good way to clarify Amoris. We need more nuance and explanation. In some cases, there can be access to communion, but there needs to be a discernment based on their subjective culpability. And here is where I think that when Eduardo asks where is resistance to light in Francis' pedagogy, where is focusing on the objective norms, notice that for the discernment that would open the door to the Eucharist, for this discernment to happen, Amoris Laetitia, paragraph 300 says, the following conditions must necessarily be present: humility, discretion, and love for the church and their teaching, in a sincere search for God's will and a desire to make a more perfect response to it. These are not people who are looking for justifications. These are people who already know the church's teaching and will to make a more perfect response to it. The paragraph continues. These attitudes are essential for avoiding the grave danger of misunderstandings, such as the notion that any priest can quickly grant exceptions. So the idea that there are exceptions is a grave misunderstanding. When a responsible and tactful person who does not presume to put his or her own desires ahead of the common good of the church meets with a pastor capable of acknowledging the seriousness of the matter before him, there can be no risks that a specific discernment may lead people to think that the church maintains a double standard. Now, the Buenos Aires guidelines, which on the opening statement I said are the only proper interpretation of Amoris Laetitia, according to Pope Francis, these Buenos Aires guidelines further clarify. We must avoid understanding this possibility as an unrestricted access to the sacraments, or as if any situation justified it. Now, regarding Regarding the Familiaris Consortio, I just want to say very quickly, because the first Dubian mentions Familiaris Consortio, that the paragraph 84 says, the Church reaffirms her practice, which is based upon sacred scripture, of not admitting to Eucharistic communion divorced and remarried persons who have remarried. So it's a practice, so it can be replaced by another practice. And yes, it's based upon sacred scripture, as is proper, but that doesn't mean that other practices are also not based on sound doctrine, and I believe that Amoris Laetitia is one of those. Now, just to finalize my first intervention regarding the dubia, I would like to point out that there's a certain barrier of communication between Pope Francis and those who support Amoris Laetitia, and between those who are more critical of Amoris Laetitia. In that it seems like we are seeing these concrete situations in different ways. Eduardo and those who are more critical of Amoris Laetitia view these situations, in my opinion, more like a picture. So their focus is on what's happening now. What's happening now is the objective situation of sin. But Francis views this not as a picture, but more like a movie. So it is a path and a journey away from the objective situation of sin. So as Rocco Buttiglione again summarizes, for Francis, what matters most is in what direction is the sinner moving? So let's take a person who is very experienced in the faith, who has exercised himself in virtue, who is more advanced on the path to perfection. And this person, for some reason, takes a step backwards away from the Father. This is worse than a sinner who takes a step forward towards the Father. even if the sinner is, after this step, in terms of absolute distance, still less perfect than the other person. The direction of a movement counts more than the absolute distance. And that's what Francis means in Evangelium Gaudium, which is programmatic of his pontificate, when he says his principle, time, the movement, is greater than space, which is the distance. Francis is a pope of processes. For him, it doesn't matter whether this process of conversion starts with a small step or a big step. What matters is that it starts. And as soon as the process is set in motion, the church can take over with help of the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And the grace that comes from the sacraments will help the sinner in that process. So it's not about a moral calculus of a lesser evil. Moral calculus already seems to imply that the person is looking for justifications. Again, as I said, it's not that. The moral calculus has to do only with the state of the soul, so that the person can know if that person is in mortal and venial sin, and if that person can receive communion and receive grace from that Eucharist. It's not about mentioning whether they have an exception or whether they have a justification. Those cases that Eduardo mentions of people may see the fidelity, be endangered, especially if there are children present, this calculus has to do only with their subjective culpability. And that's for me the point. We're not talking about the objective nature of sin. We're not trying to justify it. We are talking about people who already have a love of the church in their teaching, but they need our pastoral help. That's for me what's at this moment important.
Okay, and Pedro, your sound is still going in and out. Unfortunately, I don't know what you can do.
Okay.
It always seems to work better when you're just talking, but when you're presenting, it goes a little in and out. We can hear it, but it's
you can understand what I'm saying.
It's still erratic, and there's those little moments of silence in between.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not that your points aren't coming through, but it's yeah. Anyway, I don't know what you can do about it. We're just gonna have to soldier on. Yes,
I'll try on my end. Okay.
Well, see, right now when you're talking, it's fine, but when you start presenting, then it starts getting erratic.
I don't know why that is.
Okay.
Maybe it's the Holy Spirit doesn't want your message to get across. I'm joking, of course.
I don't. Yeah.
Okay.
No.
I'll mute myself. You can continue now. Okay.
Well, I think Pedro, you're going to be first. This is Dubia number 2, and I should have said it was done by these cardinals. I should name them just in case people don't know. Walter Braunmüller, Raymond Burke, Carlo Cafara, and Joachim Meisner were the
and Cardinal Burke. Did you mention Burke?
Yeah, Raymond Burke. Yep.
Yeah, Raymond Burke.
Okay, so the second.
Can I just? Can you hear me?
Better.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
That's better.
Yeah, okay.
Let's see if this is the time.
It might have to do with the speed of
Okay,
when
you can continue. You can continue.
Okay, so here, let me read the second dubia. After the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, does one still need to regard as valid the teaching of John Paul's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, and they point to number 79, based on sacred scripture and on the tradition of the church, on the existence of absolute moral norms that prohibit intrinsically evil acts and that are binding without exception. So the focus here is whether we can continue to maintain, after Amoris Laetitia, the idea of these absolute moral norms, which then lead to intrinsically evil act. So Pedro, you're up first.
Okay. I'll just ask if there is another. Please tell me so that I will try to set it on
Yes,
my side.
I will.
Okay. So regarding dubium 1, yes, I do believe that we can and must regard veritatis splendor as valid. There
It starts again.
are still
It
Yeah.
started again.
Starts right.
Static. Static starts coming through.
okay. What about now?
Say more.
More? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you when you
Static?
speak like that. It seems fine, but
Okay. So yes, I believe that veritatis splendor, we must regard it still as valid. There are still absolute moral norms which are binding without exceptions. There are still intrinsically evil acts which aren't justified in any situation. But again, that has to do with the objective nature of sin. And I believe that Amoris leaves that untouched. Amoris deals again with subjective culpability. And Veritatis Splendor also acknowledges this part of doctrine. Veritatis chapter 61 says, an error of conscience can be the result of an invincible ignorance, an ignorance of which the subject is not aware and which he is unable to overcome by himself. Veritatis number 70 also reaffirms the importance and permanent validity of the distinction between mortal and venial sins in accordance with the Church's tradition, both in moral theology and in pastoral practice. One is familiar with cases in which an act which is grave by reason of its matter does not constitute a mortal sin because of a lack of full awareness or deliberate consent on the part of the person performing it. Again, so this is Veritatis Splendor reaffirming the doctrine of mitigating circumstances. Now, I would just like to also bring up something that Eduardo mentioned, which is the concept of analogy. Okay, so
it's good. Very good.
yeah, okay, so regarding this concept of Eduardo mentioned that Amoris Laetitia considers the divorced and remarried couple some irregular situations as analogous to marriage, and that this would be wrong. So I would like to highlight this, okay? So it's paragraph 292. Some forms of union radically contradict the ideal, while others realize it in at least a partial and analogous way. Now, analogous way is a very theologically charged term. Analogical reasoning is something that dates back to Aquinas. And for example, Thomas Guarino, who published an excellent and seminal book on the disputed teachings of Vatican II, he mentions how the teachings of the Second Vatican Council are as regards to non-Catholic Christian churches and communities, that these teaching about those non-Catholic churches and communities also uses analogical reasoning. Those non-Catholic churches and communities are secondary analogates of the Catholic Church. And I find that Eduardo was very insightful when he brought up in his last interview with Eric Sammons for Crisis magazine the concept of the seeds of the gospel. It says, when we think about non-Christian religions, and we say that there are seeds of the word there, where you can find elements of truth and goodness there. And Eduardo also mentioned that Amoris Laetitia also uses the concept of seeds of the word. But this time, instead of using it for the non-Catholic churches and communities, he uses it for irregular situations. There's a whole section that is about that, seeds of the word in these irregular situations. However, in his interview, Eduardo also clarified. Now, what the church never says is that those religions in and of themselves are salvific, and he reaffirmed it now again. But Eduardo concludes that Amoris preaches that irregular situations seem to be justified, like as if in qua for themselves they are salvific. But that, in my opinion, is not warranted by the document.
those irregular situations are analogous to marriage, the same way other churches are analogous to the Catholic Church, without the former obscuring the latter. We are not saying that other religions are salvific. We are not saying that other religions are like justified. So we should apply the same reasoning for marriage and irregular situations, because the ring is the same. Also, I would just like to end by clarifying which forms of union are analogous and which are not. Francis's analogical reasoning for the divorced and remarried couples and for non-married cohabitating couples. But as regards to homosexual unions, Amoris Laetitia paragraph 251 is very, very clear. There are absolutely no grounds for considering homosexual unions to be in any way or even remotely analogous to God's plan for marriage and family. So analogical reasoning is being applied only to these: cohabitating couples, non-married couples, and divorced and remarried couples. And after mentioning those irregular situations, Francis goes on to explain the doctrine of mitigating circumstances. All the next paragraphs are about that.
Okay, perfect. That's perfect. 5 minutes. Great. All right, Eduardo.
All right. So just for the sake of clarification, yes, I did say that you can find elements, according Nostra Aetate, you can find elements of truth and sanctification in those non-Christian religions. But the religions, qua religions, are not vehicles of salvation. In fact, to take a concrete example, Islam must be false because it denies the incarnation, the atoning work of Christ, and so on. So there's an incompatible element there. Those central claims are incompatible. Now, when we apply the notion of the seeds of the word to marriage, again, the same thing, it seems to me, applicable. Even if you can find constructive elements, elements that resemble marriage or in some way are analogous, such that you can find similar elements of marriage. The fact is, if you don't talk then about the relationship, qua relationship being a sinful relationship, it seems to me that you're then going to think that those elements somehow, you're not going to see that those elements and the marriage as a whole, or the cohabiting relationship as a whole, is going to be a serious obstacle to attaining conjugal marriage. So it seems to me that if you go back and you look at the document from the Synod itself actually used the whole notion of analogy, seeds of the words, with respect to homosexual relations. I think that's one of the reasons why you have the bishops, the German bishops, arguing for blessings of same-sex unions and so on. Now, I don't want to go, I want to just take a few moments. Also, again, it seems to me it's not just about mitigating circumstances. Paragraph 304, the Pope is trying to carve out an exception to, remember, I think he confuses negative moral precepts and positive moral precepts. So taking those positive moral precepts to have presumptive validity, he's trying to carve out an exception to that. He says in paragraph 304, it is reductive simply to consider whether or not an individual's actions correspond to a general law or rule, because that is not enough to discern and ensure full fidelity to God in the concrete life of a human being. That's when he tries to incorporate Thomas's discussion about positive moral precepts that have presumptive validity, where Thomas says that there are exceptions. He says there are exceptions. There are no exceptions with respect to the moral absolute, but it seems to me the Pope confuses the two kinds of precepts. One other thing, and that is, if we go back to paragraph 303, which I said is the sort of the crux of the matter here with respect to justification, it's going to be person and situation specific. I think the Pope's view implies the gradualism of the law, I've already defined what that is, but in paragraph 303, he says, yet conscience can do more than recognize that a given situation does not correspond objectively to the overall demands of the gospel. It can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response or the most generous offering. The whole business about the Latin making a definitive difference as to how one reads it, to me, is totally unsustainable. What for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while yet not fully the objective ideal or the objective standard or the objective exemplar. I don't think that the quote unquote the ideal is unattainable, but I do think that Francis renders the moral law ceases to have an obligatory force, and it assumes an aspiring force. So you aspire. Of course, I agree with Pedro that there's a dynamic there. There's no question that there's a dynamic. It's not a static picture. A person is going to be called, to embody more fully the objective demands of the law. But in that specific situation where two people continue to have sex, the divorced and civilly remarried, Francis, I think, is trying to justify that. Hence the ethic of the lesser of two evils calculus. I don't see how you can get out of that. Hence also the whole attempt to carve out an exception to the law, which he does in paragraph 304. That's why he also cites paragraph 305. That's why he also thinks that if you appeal to the moral law, he thinks to those living in irregular situations, you're like a pastor who's throwing stones at people's lives, again, the sitting on the chair of Moses and judging at times with superiority and superficiality, difficult cases and wounded families. Also, let's not forget, haven't even gotten into that, the whole Francis diminishes the significance of abstract truth. He says quite the logic of black and white. No mention here of mitigating circumstances. The logic of black and white can lead to casuistic abstraction. Instead, discernment means going beyond the gray areas of life, according to God's will. That's what 303 is about. And you look for God's will by following the true doctrine of the gospel and not in the fixity of an abstract doctrine, such that an abstract doctrine, a universally valid moral precept, negative moral precepts that's always and everywhere valid. So I know that Pedro thinks that mitigating circumstances are sufficient to justify all this, but it seems to me, if you look at the Pope's own position, where he tries to provide a justification, he doesn't like the word justification, but it is a justification, on the way to, one hopes, on the way to a more full realization of the objective demands of the law.
Okay.
There is a justification. He tries to give a justification for engaging in sex. He tries to find an exception for the moral law because he confuses moral absolutes, negative precepts with positive precepes.
All right. Okay.
Etc.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
So just one clarification.
Yeah.
Can you please refer me what is the quote about being not everything being black and white? Is it?
Oh, there are so many.
305, right?
No. Well, yeah. Let's see. I'd have to look. There are many places in his, not just in Amoris Laetitia, but throughout the Pope. The Pope. It seems to me, I've written about this. He minimizes the content of faith, propositions. abstract truth, which are in fact propositions. He rejects absolute moral. He rejects absolute truth. Blah blah blah.
Okay, so let's move on to the third, and I'm sure we're getting down to the real issues here. So this is good. All right, so the third dubia, and Eduardo is going to go first. Let me read it here. After Amoris Laetitia, is it still possible to affirm that a person who habitually lives in contradiction to a commandment of God's law, as for instance, the one that prohibits adultery, Matthew 19:3-9, finds him or herself in an objective situation of grave habitual sin? So, Eduardo, you have 5 minutes.
Well, I would say that all things considered from the Pope's writings, I would say, yes, he thinks that you can continue to have sex, conjugal sex, in a divorce and civilly remarried situation. And again, if we go back to 303, it can also recognize, the person can recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response. So what for now is the most generous response, which can be given to God in this situation, is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexities of one's limits, while yet not fully the objective ideal or the objective norm, or however you want to translate that. It's not synonymous with the specific choices that the person is making. So now, of course, it seems to me, even if one wants to consider that a venial sin because of mitigating circumstances, which, as I said, I don't accept that interpretation as a full justification for the Pope's position, because I think he engages in, the lesser of two evils calculus, which, if I understand Pedro, he doesn't deny that. He just thinks that the Pope is not concerned with justification. He's concerned with whatever goodness. But I don't see whatever goodness in that relationship is the dynamic that opens the person up to a further realization of the objective norm. But it seems to me that this, again, is the idea that you can sin in order to bring about a good. You can sin in order to bring about a good. The fact that, I don't know how else to read paragraph 304, where the Pope is saying that there are exceptions. That's why he's appealing to Thomas. Here he's not appealing to Thomas for mitigating circumstances. The other thing that I think is problematic about the notion of mitigating circumstances, Pedro always refers to invincible ignorance. But the fact is, there is vincible ignorance. John Paul II, again, in the encyclical In Veritatis Splendor, is actually citing Gaudium et Spes, where he says, again, this is in paragraph 63, conscience as the ultimate concrete judgment compromises its dignity when it is culpably erroneous. That is to say, quote, he's quoting from Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, when man shows little concern for seeking what is true and good, and conscience gradually becomes almost blind from being accustomed to sin. Now, I do not see why all of the people who are in, let's say, in mitigating circumstances, why we can, why we have the optimism, why we have the optimism, and I sense that there's a certain optimism in Pedro as well, to hold individual blameless without considering the reasons why they are unwilling to address the difficulty. Because remember, it's not just mitigating circumstance, not just ignorance, it's that the Pope rightly says there are people who say, I understand the rule, but I can't accept it, or it doesn't make sense to me. He says that. And it seems to me there's no mention made, and Pedro doesn't make mention of it in its entire book. I could be wrong, but I don't remember him ever talking about vincible ignorance, or even or even pushing back against the people who say they're unable to follow the rule or they don't understand. Someone who said, someone who's told, the church teaches, like John Paul II in Love and Responsibility, he crafts a whole argument for why premarital sex is wrong. And a person who says, well, I don't think premarital sex is wrong. There's no mention made in the Pope's thing about the reasoning that led these people to hold these false beliefs. For example, negligent reasoning, presuppositions that they're operating with, ideological rationalization, wishful thinking. Yes, you can draw on the church's solid body of reflection concerning mitigating factors and situations, but it seems to me that there's a tendency here to overlook the corresponding body of reflection concerning whether the ignorance is voluntary or not, invincible or vincible, and hence a result of ethical value blindness, to use what's his name, von Hildebrandt's term. So I just think it just seems to me it's too easy. It's too easy because it's not even the Pope's position. It seems to me, if you consider everything he says in chapter 8, it's too easy to focus on mitigating circumstances, particularly if you don't distinguish between invincible, vincible ignorance, but also the fact that those circumstances, the people who aren't able to recognize or aren't able to accept the rules or whatever, in fact, you have to push back against them. You have to say, well, why? What are your reasons for this? You can't just let them. You can't just accept. Oh, okay, no.
Okay, all right. So Pedro, 5 minutes.
Okay. So regarding Dubium 3, again, I think that we can and must continue saying that a person in that situation is in an objective situation of grave habitual sin. This dubium was formulated so that an yes answer would contradict the canon law. But I explain in my book that there is here a disagreement between Pope Francis and the Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts at the time of John Paul II on what constitutes manifest and what constitutes grave sin. Does grave sin mean a mortal sin, or does it mean a sin with grave matter? So I refer people to my book so that they will explore the canon law issues with more detail, because Eduardo brings many other good points that I want to address. First of all, Eduardo mentioned that the seeds of the gospel also were mentioned in the Synod's work document for homosexual unions. I just want to highlight that what matters is what Amoris Laetitia says, not the work document. Now, the reason why I asked Eduardo about where he had seen the quote about black and white, I believe that it's paragraph 305, though I might have got lost along the way. If it is, I'm sorry. But Eduardo said, quoted this and say, by thinking that everything is black and white, we sometimes close off the way of grace and of growth and discourage paths of sanctification, etc., etc. And then Eduardo said, there's no subjective culpability, no mitigating factors here. But there is. Subjective culpability is mentioned 7 lines above. It's in the same paragraph. So everything that is said here is about subjective culpability. Now, going back to paragraph 304, in which we talk about Thomas, I would like to just say that, yes, Francis quotes Aquinas saying that although there is necessity in the general principles, the more we descend to matters of detail, the more frequently we encounter defects. In matters of action, truth or practical rectitude is not the same for all as to matters of detail, but only as to general principles. The principle will be found to fail according as we descend further into detail. Okay, And supposedly, Amoris quotes Thomas Aquinas on that, and Eduardo thinks he's being misquoted. Okay. But paragraph 304 goes on to clarify, and this is Pope Francis speaking. It is true that general rules set forth the good, which can never be disregarded or neglected. I emphasize, general rules can never be disregarded or neglected. So only then, Francis goes on to say that in their formulation, these general rules cannot provide absolutely for all particular situations. So whatever Francis means by this, it must be read in light of the fact that general rules can never be disregarded or neglected. And so from that point onward, we may introduce the subjective culpability, the mitigating factors, because that's the preceding paragraphs, 300 to 303, all talk about mitigating factors. So we cannot just simply, Eduardo says that we must read the document as a whole. If we must read the document as a whole, we cannot just forget what the previous paragraph said. So, and now, basing ourselves into the subjective culpability part of the equation, Thomas really mentions full consent. For Aquinas, there is a distinction between human acts and acts of man. Human acts are actions properly called, and we choose to perform them out of our own will. And acts of man are acts that we practice out of external influences outside of our will. And these are passions. They are called passions. And of course, our passions don't cancel our free will. We can and must order both our acts and our passions to reason. But to order our passions to reason, we need habits. And habits are not punctual activities. They are a continuous disposition. They take time to develop. So a person who doesn't have his or her passions ordered towards reason through habits is less culpable than a person who deliberately chose to act through his or her own will. And also regarding full knowledge, Eduardo mentions that Pope Francis thinks that a person can just say, oh, I know this teaching, but I don't accept it. That's not what it says. It says people who may have difficulty understanding. And here Thomas also has an idea that the authority is not the supreme criterion or rule of certitude. For you cannot just say with authority of the church, and this is the rule of certitude. For it to be a rule of certitude, reason must have ascertained this before it is entitled to our assent. Summa Theologia says, to believe is an act of the intellect, inasmuch as the will moves it to assent, and this proceeds from the will and the intellect. So not only does the will need to be ready to obey, but also the intellect needs to be well disposed to follow the command of the will. So hence there needs to be a habit of virtue, not only in the commanding will, but also in the assenting intellect.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about more about invisible ignorance maybe in the next dubia, maybe.
Okay. All right. I mean,
can I just jump in? If you everything that Pedro just said, I have no problem with. I just don't think that that informs paragraph 303. And furthermore, the Pope does say that these people, and this is in paragraph 295, are not in a position, they claim, to understand, appreciate, or fully carry out the objective demands of the law. So it seems to me what you have to ask there, because I don't think you can assume that these people are invincibly ignorant. They're not invincibly ignorant, because this has nothing to do with ignorance. This means that they don't accept the moral principles, the moral rules, etc. So then the question is whether or not, as I said, then the question you have to ask is, well, why don't you? Why don't you accept it? Their inability to accept it may have something to do with false reasoning, ideological rationalization, presuppositions, etc., etc. So mitigating circumstances is not going to help. It doesn't help in this kind of situation. It doesn't help because these people may in fact be accountable for the failure to actually pursue, well, what's at stake here? How do I understand this? And it just seems to me that that's I missed that. I missed that in your book. I miss it also in the Pope's in paragraph in this chapter. It seems to me one has to push back when the Pope talks about, like I gave the example of his welcoming, those that cohabit, they're not married, etc.
Okay, so well, let's. I think this will come up at least in the next, if not in the other one. So let me read the Dubium 4. After the affirmations of Amoris Laetitia, number 302, on, quote, this is going to get to what we're arguing about here, circumstances which mitigate moral responsibility, does one still need to regard as valid the teaching of St. John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, number 81, based on sacred scripture and tradition, according to which, quote, circumstances or intentions can never transform an act intrinsically evil by virtue of its object into an act subjectively good or defensible as a choice? And so Pedro begins.
So, as I said before, since I believe that subjective culpability doesn't change the intrinsically evil nature of sin, so circumstances can't turn an intrinsically evil sin into a subjective good or defensible choice. Okay, so that's my argument. Now, I would like to address Eduardo's argument about vincible ignorance. That Pope Francis and I don't speak much about vincible ignorance. It's correct because, again, our point is not about vincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance can and should be defeated. That's vincible in Latin, says defeated. So it should be defeated. But again, what Francis and me, what we are talking about is subjective culpability. So we are either talking about invincible ignorance or lack of full consent. And for me, these are the people who have difficulty to appreciate, that's full knowledge, or fully carry on, full consent, the demands of the law. So, and I find this interesting because I wrote this in my book, that when I present the teaching of mitigating circumstances, usually the reply is, yes, ignorance may diminish subjective culpability, but in that case, the priest must inform the sinner of his sin, thereby dispelling his ignorance. And from that point onward, all of this ceases to apply. And Eduardo didn't say that exactly, but he says, why shouldn't we? Why don't we push? Yes, we should push, period. We are in agreement. But I want to point out that this seems like an argument, but it's actually a set of two arguments. First, it implies that ignorance ceases a mitigating circumstance simply when we inform the sinner that he is sinning. And second, we swept full consent under the rug. And from this point onward, only ignorance and full knowledge is being considered from that point on. So I don't think that I talk much about invincible ignorance in my book. I mean, I talk, yes. But I also mentioned that Amoris Laetitia doesn't talk much about ignorance, vincible or invincible. Francis dedicates half a sentence to the part of full knowledge, but he develops the concept of full consent throughout almost 2 paragraphs. And usually this full consent part of the equation is ignored in all these debates about Amoris Laetitia. But I think most of these irregular situations that apply, to which Amoris Laetitia apply, most of them are more about full consent and full knowledge. And I would like to bring out that full consent is not merely hindered in cases of rape. The catechism, the parts of the catechism that Francis quotes in Amoris Laetitia, mention that many external pressures may hamper full consent. But even if we were talking only about ignorance, it's not simply a matter of trying to defeat ignorance by informing the sinner. First of all, the church has always understood that there's a dilemma between informing a sinner that is not prepared to receive the full truth. Because in that case, the sinner will cease to be a mere material sinner and will become a formal sinner, which is graver. And this is the principle, the pastoral principle of good faith, which is applied in church documents and even by some saints. And also, and most importantly, just because the person is informed doesn't mean that the person understands. And here, yes, we must try to find out why the person doesn't understand. Eduardo mentions very well ideological biases, traumas even, who knows?
Negligent reasoning.
Yeah, yes, okay, erroneous reasoning. But just if a person is informed but doesn't understand, this is not full knowledge, as I mentioned before when I quoted Aquinas. Again, Rocco Buttiglione, a disciple of John Paul II, says in his book, which unfortunately is only in Italian, Risposte Amichevoli.
In Spanish as well.
Is okay, yes, but not in English. The principles are always present in practical reason, the principles, but the habitus applies them into particular cases. And here the capacity to recognize the principles in the concrete situation may be faulty. And that's why I think that's how we should read, in my opinion, paragraph 301 of Amoris Laetitia. More is involved here than mere ignorance of the rule. A subject may know full well the rule, yet have difficulty in understanding, not accepting, understanding its inherent values. Yes, we should try to defeat this, but it's still a mitigating circumstance, which is, again, not the most important one. For me, full consent is the more important one.
Okay. You're great at sticking to the 5 minutes, Pedro, I have to say.
Thank you.
Okay. Eduardo.
Okay, so I don't want to repeat myself. I've said several times now that mitigating circumstances is not sufficient to provide a justification for two people that are divorced and civilly remarried or cohabiting or whatever the examples that one might consider there. Again, I think, and the lesser of two evils calculus, if we go back for a moment to, yes, I agree that in paragraph 304, that the Pope does say it is true that general rules set forth a good which can never be disregarded or neglected, but in their formulation, they cannot provide absolutely for all particular situations. So clearly here, again, I don't see that he's actually acknowledging the distinction between negative precepts and positive precepts, because he's admitting that positive precepts that have presumptive validity can, in fact, be insufficient for a specific situation. So it seems to me that there are going to be exceptions there. The other thing is, maybe I can focus on that since we haven't, and that is the whole matter of venial sin. So even if we assume that it becomes a venial sin because it lacks full knowledge and full consent, I don't hear it from the Pope in Amoris Laetitia, but I don't hear it from Pedro as well. In paragraph 1862 of the Catechism, it says one commits venial sin when in a less serious matter one does not observe the standard prescribed by the moral law, or when one disobeys the moral law in a grave matter, but without full knowledge or without complete consent. But then it says, and this I don't hear from Pedro, and I don't hear it from Francis. Venial sin, it says, weakens charity. It manifests a disordered affection for created goods. It impedes the soul's progress in the exercise of the virtues and the practice of the moral good. It merits, I don't hear this, it merits temporal punishment, deliberate and unrepentant venial sin disposes us little by little to commit mortal sin. However, venial sin does not break the covenant with God. We can all agree with that. With God's grace, it is humanly reparable. Venial sin does not deprive the sinner of sanctifying grace, friendship with God, charity, and consequently eternal happiness. So it seems to me that, and I've argued this throughout, mitigating circumstances is not sufficient to explain the pastoral logic and the moral reasoning involved in Amoris Laetitia. That you have the lesser of two evils calculus. You have the Pope, I think, confusing negative moral precepts with positive moral precepts. Those positive moral precepts, which, as a general rule, can't be disregarded. You can't disregard it. You can't say it doesn't matter, but you can still find an exception there, such that the rule becomes indeterminate. The more specific the act is, the more specific the circumstance is. And then also the whole matter of how to properly interpret 303. What is the most generous response that can be given to God? And you come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God himself is asking amid the concrete circumstances, the concrete complexity of one's limit, while yet not fully the objective. It seems to me here the Pope affirms the gradualness of the law, because he's allowing that in a situation, and by the way, not only does the Pope do this, but certainly his interpreters have done this. For instance, Cardinal Supich says that you have to consider the circumstances where, and he applies it to homosexuality, whether they can receive a communion, and he appeals to paragraph 303 as a way of justifying, because he sees that these people, this is the best that they can do given the circumstances, and so there can be a certain moral security, he says, that this is what God himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's limits. Now, you can take that. I agree with Pedro that there's a dynamic built into that. The Pope doesn't say, well, that's it. The picture is not static. But the fact is, his position, it's such, as I read it, it allows a person in that kind of situation to do evil in order that good may come. Okay. The good being the full realization of the moral law.
All right. So we're at the last of the dubia. Here it goes. Eduardo's going to go first. After Amoris Laetitia, this is number 303, which has been mentioned a bunch of times. Does one still need to regard as valid the teaching of St. John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, number 56, based on scripture and tradition, that excludes a creative interpretation of the role of conscience, and that emphasizes that conscience can never be authorized to legitimate exceptions to absolute moral norms that prohibit intrinsically evil acts by virtue of their object? So, Eduardo?
The fact that the Pope himself thinks that it's necessary to mention that he's not suggesting some kind of double status here, or that there are two levels of truth, one at the level of the concrete circumstance and the other at the objective level, tells you that he senses that something is awry here, even though, of course, he doesn't admit. But I think that that Francis, or at least that these texts, these crucial texts, 303, 304, and so on, I think they can be read to prioritize, in the pastoral logic, to prioritize the more concrete existential consideration, to quote the Pope, John Paul II. He says, the latter, John Paul says, by taking account of circumstances and the situation could legitimately be the basis of certain exceptions to the general rule. I think that's what Francis does. And thus permit one to do in practice and in good conscience what is qualified as intrinsically evil by the moral law. Now we can discuss here the whole question of whether mitigating circumstances, render, being two people in that relationship being sexual, whether that's a venial sin. Okay, I don't have any problem if there are genuine exceptions to that. Although I do think that it still doesn't provide a justification for having sex. A separation or even an opposition is thus established in some cases between the teaching of the precept, which is valid in general, and the norm of the individual conscience, which would in fact make the final decision about what is good and what is evil. On this basis, an attempt is made to legitimize so-called pastoral solutions contrary to the teaching of the magisterium, John Paul writes, and to justify a creative hermeneutic according to which the moral conscience is in no way obliged in every case by a particular negative precept. Now, of course, all of this presupposes that we're talking here about negative moral precepts that are always that are moral absolutes and hence exceptionless and so on. We all agree that Francis is not saying that it's permissible, that it's okay to commit adultery. Okay. But I still think that given his understanding of mitigating circumstances, or the understanding that Pedro has set forth, I still think that it seems to me that there's a confusion between negative and positive moral precepts. There's also, the attempt to argue that having sex in a divorce and civilly remarried situation, that's a venial sin. It seems to me we have to bring out the impact of venial sin as the Catechism does. As I said, I didn't hear that. I don't hear that in the Pope. And one of the reasons we don't hear it, I think, is because if you go back to where I started today, is that he thinks that you have all these good elements, and then it seems to me there's a flip in taking those good elements to mean that the relationship as such is good, and hence somehow ordered to the good of marriage. It seems to me that that's just not the case. There's no mention of sin in that sense. The mere fact that he's talking. Pedro says he's talking about people who want to pursue the good. But how do they want to pursue the good? They want to pursue the good by having sex. And so, in that respect, it contradicts the. They want to pursue the good by having sex, because having sex is a lesser evil than the greater evil of not having sex and having impact on the marriage, on the children, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that when all is said and done, yes, the Pope is silent, I would say, about moral absolutes, negative moral precepts. He thinks that they're just abstract truths. And so he doesn't talk about, he doesn't really talk about the status of those truths, because he's primarily concerned with the concrete, as Pedro says, he's concerned with the concrete situation of these couples. But it seems to me that and Pedro acknowledges that you have the point about when someone is unable to understand or fails to acknowledge, you have to push back. And of course, I don't think that all you have to do is tell that person who comes into you're a pastor, and you tell that person, you just tell them, well, you know what you're doing is actually wrong, and that somehow lifts him from his invincible ignorance. Because in many of these situations, it's not about ignorance. It's about misunderstanding. It's about false, as I've said, ideological rationalizations. It's about false reasoning. It's about faulty presuppositions that inform. And so all of those things not only pertain to full knowledge, but they also pertain to consent, the activity of the will.
All right. Okay, we're gonna have closing statements. So
I thought that I was going to address Dubia 5.
you are. I'm just saying that we can move to yours.
Yeah. So just one point. I agree with Eduardo. Venial sin weakens. And I think I mentioned in my book, either the Baltimore Catechism or the Catechism of Council of Trent, or both, that the sin darkens the intellect and weakens the will. No problem around that. But as Eduardo quoted from the Catechism, venial sin does not deprive the sinner from the grace of God, from communion. So if the sinner is weakened, the more he benefits from receiving the strength from sacramental grace. It's not, as Pope Francis says, being a reward for the just. It is about being a medicine for the weak. Now, regarding the Dubium 5, I don't think that Amoris asks for a creative interpretation of the role of conscience in the way that is condemned by Veritatis Splendor. Because Veritatis Splendor condemns this creative interpretation in the sense that conscience would create exceptions or make an intrinsically evil act all right. Again, my position is that Amoris Laetitia does not do that. Amoris tries to deal with the formation of conscience and discernment of subjective culpability of objectively evil acts. Now, regarding paragraph 303, Pope Francis says, yet conscience can do more than recognize that a given situation corresponds objectively to the overall demands of the gospel. It can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God himself is asking, amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while yet not fully the objective ideal. So what is this it that God is asking? Is it the situation that does not correspond objectively to the overall demands of the gospel? Or is it the most generous response that can be given to God? In other words, does God will someone to remain in an objective situation of sin, which is, I think, what some of critics think it is? Or does God will that someone give an answer rather than remain as he is, even if that answer is imperfect? Eduardo seems to believe that this quote refers to remaining in the objective situation of sin. That's why we're talking about creating exceptions, justifications. But how can this be the will of God? Remaining in an objective situation of sin be the will of God? If some paragraphs earlier, in paragraph 291, Francis said any breach of the marriage bond is against the will of God. How can this situation be against the will of God in one paragraph and be the will of God in the other? So this interpretation creates unnecessary internal inconsistencies. So when Francis speaks of what God is asking, the situation that does not correspond to the objective demands of the gospel is in the previous sentence. The most generous response is in the same sentence, just before Francis says, this is what God himself is asking. And this interpretation is more consistent. In fact, the whole paragraph starts with recognizing the influence of such concrete factors. We can add that individual conscience needs to be better incorporated into the church's praxis in certain situations that do not objectively embody our understanding of marriage. So everything that has to do with conscience being incorporated in these situations has to be read through the concrete factors. And these concrete factors are the mitigating factors that are explained in the previous paragraphs. And finally, I would just like to talk about the law of gradualness, because it's something that also has been talked about a lot. And yes, Familiaris Consortio says, that we should avoid the gradualness of the law and not confuse this with law of gradualness. And Francis accepts this. Okay, again, he says that for this discernment to happen, okay, we must have humility and discretion, love for the church and the teaching, in a sincere search for God's will and the desire to make a more perfect response to it. Amoris Laetitia, paragraph 295 says, human beings know, love, and accomplish moral good by different stages of growth. This is not a gradualness of the law, says Amoris Laetitia. And later, on Amoris, paragraph 300, given that gradualness is not in the law itself, this discernment can never prescind from the gospel demands of truth and charity as proposed by the church. So I believe that if Francis writes these caveats, we should take them seriously as boundaries that we shouldn't cross if we are to interpret this document accurately. It's not that he senses that something has arrived with what he wants. He is clarifying what he wants and saying, I don't want it to be extended farther into the erroneous territory. If Francis says this isn't to be construed as gradualness of the law, then we shouldn't construe it as gradualness of the law. Mm-hmm. And any interpretation that says that there is gradualness of the law should be disregarded, whether it's from his critics or from his supporters. Okay. However, the law of gradualness is by definition step by step. If therefore the goal hasn't been reached yet, if the goal was already reached, there would not be a need for gradualness.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing? I need to say something. Okay, look, you know, Pedro always cites paragraph 291. You know, where it says, where the Pope says that the Church realizes that any breach of the marriage bond is against the will of God. Well, no, yes, of course, the Pope says that, but that's in the context. You have to quote the full sentence. She is also conscious of the frailty of many of her children. It seems to me that's what needs to be focused on, because that's what he's trying to give an account of, the frailty of many of her children and the circumstances under which that frailty shows itself.
Okay, so Pedro, you can respond right to that, because we're going to go to closing statements.
Yeah, I agree with that. Pope Francis' emphasis. I agree that Pope Francis' emphasis is the frailty of those people in those situations. I completely agree. That's his emphasis, but still, he takes his time to say that any break of the bond of marriage bond is against the will of God. So that's something that we must accept.
I also don't accept, if I may just quickly, I do not, just because look, I said at the beginning of my presentation that you won't find a coherent and systematic presentation of pastoral logic and the structure of moral reasoning informing that. But when you put all of these things together, it seems to me, yes, I know that Francis says, I don't deny that. He says that this is the gradualness, the law of gradualness, and not the gradualness of the law. But when you put into the picture that is constructed here, that I constructed, in terms of the lesser of two evils calculus, in terms of the idea that applying the law to all situations is going to be reductive, he says, and so he's trying to carve out an exception. And then it seems to me the way that I don't know of any other way to read 303. If you consider the context, the context is such that paragraph opens by referring to a certain state that is objectively at variance with the universal command of the gospel, and it closes with a reference to the situation, as he says, the concrete complexity of one's limits while yet not fully the objective ideal or the objective standard. So in between that, that's where you have the reference to the generous response which can be given to God and come to see whether a certain moral security, that is what God himself is asking him, at the concrete complexity of one's limits, etc. It seems to me if you understand the calculus, this lesser of two evil calculus, the attempt to carve out exceptions and so on, then it doesn't seem foolish. Regardless, just because somebody asserts something doesn't mean that you asserted that, that's wonderful. No, just because the Pope says X, that doesn't mean, when you consider the whole framework that he's working with, that X isn't somehow problematic. I don't see why the Pope has to justify the claims that he's making in terms of the scriptures and the tradition. The mere fact that he says X doesn't mean that X is somehow untouchable and so on. So I don't see any other way, since at both the beginning and the end of this short paragraph, the text refers to those moments of falling short. How can we not think that what he's referring to as the most generous response, if he meant to say living together as brother and sister, he could have said that, because he cited 84 earlier on. He could have said that, but he doesn't say that. So
so I'm trying to figure out where we are on the closing statements here, but which is fine. Pedro, you want to? What?
Nothing. Please proceed.
Yeah. So why don't you make a response to that by way of your closing statement, and then Eduardo will have some time.
The only thing that I would like to say is that paragraph 303 starts with recognizing the influence of such concrete factors. So, and it links to the previous paragraphs that talk about mitigating circumstances. I can now then give my concluding statement.
Sure. Go ahead.
At the end of this discussion, I would like to highlight that it's not possible to exhaust everything that needs to be said about this topic in an hour or two. Many arguments that I left unsaid are expounded on, and many arguments that I explained here are better fleshed out in my book, The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia by Whitford. So it's much more detailed than anything that I could say here. So as for this discussion, again, my position, and I hope to have proven it at least in a cogent way, that I think that Amoris Laetitia rests on the doctrine of subjective culpability and mitigating factors in a way that is not meant to be read as justifying the objective evil nature of an intrinsically evil act. This cannot be heterodox, since all the supposed magisterial authorities that allegedly contradict Amoris also affirm this doctrine, from Aquinas to John Paul II, and even Eduardo says so. So all teach that there are mitigating factors diminishing subjective culpability, so that a sinner is not in mortal sin, and the sinner who is not in mortal sin may receive communion. So not only is Amoris Laetitia not contradictory with prior magisterial documents, I believe it is continuous with them. Familiaris Consortio asks for a greater dialogue between pastors and laity. In this way, is open to its progressive development. So it goes on to say that it is useful to recall that the proximate and obligatory teaching of the faith, also concerning family matters, belongs to the hierarchical magisterium. As for Veritatis Splendor, it's a renewal of moral theology. This phrase of renewal of moral theology appears 3 times in Veritatis Splendor. And this renewal that John Paul II calls for, again, according to Veritatis, is not merely a legalistic interpretation of the commandments or a set of precepts. It calls for an intense pastoral effort, which resides not so much in doctrinal statements as in constantly looking to the Lord Jesus. This is in Veritatis. The task of authentically interpreting the Word of God has been entrusted to the Church's living magisterium. This is apparent from the living tradition, which comes from the apostles and which progresses in the Church under the assistance of the Holy Spirit. Progresses. Therefore, we can see that Amoris Laetitia is answering the call for a renewal of moral theology per Veritatis Splendor, and of a greater dialogue between pastors and families per Familiaris Consortio. And John Paul II taught that the authority to undertake these falls within the magisterium. And the magisterium at this moment lies with Pope Francis and with Amoris Laetitia. So the tradition of the church is clear. We must give our submission of mind and will to this magisterium, and we should not fear to do so, for Jesus promised that the Holy Spirit would guide the church. As John Paul II used to cry, do not be afraid. God is with the church today as in yesterday. Good afternoon to all who are viewing it. And again, I thank Eduardo and Jim for accepting to participate in this discussion.
All right, Eduardo.
Well, I don't think I need to repeat everything I said. My emphasis was on arguing that mitigating circumstances, the question of subjective responsibility, is not sufficient to understand Pope Francis's pastoral logic and the attendant logic of moral reasoning. As I said, as I tried to emphasize repeatedly, when you put together the framework in which he engages in the pastoral logic that he wants the church to engage in, it seems to me you have again this lesser of two evils calculus, an attempt to carve out an exception to the moral law, an attempt to provide a justification. I don't see how paragraph 303 can be read any other way. Also, as Pedro acknowledged, we have to take more seriously in the pastoral logic the whole matter of not just vincible ignorance, although that's important. Ideological rationalization. Somebody comes into your office, false reasoning, a false set of presuppositions. I mean, the mere fact that someone is unable to grasp or it has a difficulty to accept a particular moral precept, we need to push back on that, and that seems to me part of the pastoral logic. You can't just accept what someone says or the position that someone takes without actually then asking him for his reasons. I don't hear that. I hear Pedro acknowledge it here, but I don't hear that in the book, in his book, and I don't hear it in Pope Francis. I think there's a certain optimism. In fact, the first time I wrote about this encyclical or this exhortation, I said that, which was right after it came out, I said, it's almost as if everybody is invincibly ignorant for the Pope, or is not subjectively responsible either because of knowledge or because of the will. I appreciate the conversation with Pedro. I think that it's not enough to, like he did, citing 291, because the fact is the emphasis in chapter 8 is not on breaching the marriage bond as being against the will of God, but on how do we deal with the frailty of many of her children, and it's in that context that it seems to me that Francis allows sexual relations as the lesser of two evils, the greater evil being, the breakdown of the marriage, how it affects children, and so on and so on. So in that respect, it seems to me he buys into the gradualness of the law. The law there being situation and person specific, on the way to, admittedly, on the way to a more fuller realization of the law. I don't know how you can have a more fuller realization of the moral law without, ceasing to have sexual relations in an invalid marriage.
Okay. Well, yeah. This. Thank you. I want to thank both participants. It's rare these days in the Roman Catholic Church for people who disagree to engage one another. It's really part of the contemporary disease that has affected theology. So this is an exception, and we should be happy about it. So I'm very grateful for Pedro for suggesting it, Eduardo giving my name, and I think this is to the good.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon then.
Yes.
Closing broadcast now.
Okay.